Good afternoon. I'm glad to see our audience survive the flash flood warning. I'm Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and a professor at Georgetown. And as the CSIS host, I want to do our usual safety announcement. We survived the flash flood. If for any reason we need to evacuate, it's my responsibility to give you instructions. And the general rule is we'll go out the way you came in, and we'll make our way to either National Geographic, which is around the corner, or we'll go straight down Rhode Island to St. Matthews. Our expectation is that half the people will go to Starbucks at DuPont Circle, but that's the plan. I'm going to be very brief because I'll have an opportunity to chair a discussion with our very distinguished panel of American and Japanese retired senior military leaders. But first I want to turn it over to my friend Dr. Yoichi Funabashi, who has organized this Military Statesmen Forum to tell you about its intent, its purpose, and a bit about what they achieved. Please, Yoichi.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. I would like to first express my deepest appreciation to CSIS, and especially to Dr. Michael Green for co-hosting this event with my think tank, Asia Pacific Initiative. I was here exactly at CSIS exactly 6 months ago, and in an event like this, exactly like this. And the theme was almost the same, the U.S.-Japan alliance in an era of geo-economic competition. It was a preview of a one-year-long project with dozens of Japanese policy experts at our think tank. The objective of that project was to identify the geopolitical and geo-economic risks to Japan and U.S.-Japan alliance and the possible ways to deal with them. Today, we are here to share some of observations and takeaways from 4 days conference, which we just have held in Washington, between retired military leaders and active duty officers, top active duty officers, and the government high-ranking officials from the US and Japan. This is a retreat-type policy discussions, this we have had this Military Statesmen Forum for now 4 years. And Dr. Michael Green has been extremely supportive from day one. We are very much now in an era of radical uncertainty, and particularly how, in reaction to these new heights of that uncertainties, we are turning our attention to tried and tested values, institutions, and methods. And the US-Japan alliance is among one of those tried and tested. And in this year's Military Statesmen Forum, we have reaffirmed that this tried and tested strategic values and significance of the US-Japan alliance. But at the same time, we have keenly realized that this alliance has to adapt to radically changing international environments, particularly in Asia Pacific. And one of the areas that we have to really evolve the alliance to adapt more effectively is in the field of economics, more accurately, the geoeconomics. Increasingly, that economic instruments are now used and utilized to achieve the geopolitical gains and objectives. And in the area, Asia Pacific particularly, we are now confronted with these challenges, particularly from China. But whether it's China or Russia or Japan and the United States and Europe, the trade policy now is increasingly has become to be a central part of national strategy. That also reflects and represents this new trend of that primacy of geoeconomics in world politics. How the U.S.-Japan relations alliance can and should deal with them. It's a very, very new theme, a challenging theme. The geoeconomics also is employed by some countries to modify or revise and even undercut the liberal international order. They just don't like the rules or rule-based order. They are now challenging that. Cyberspace is increasingly exploited and even manipulated, not only to undercut, compromise the free and fair trade and services, goods and services, but also to damage and undermine the democratic rules, process, and institutions, democracy itself. And we are now also in the midst of that radical technological revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, based on AI, big data, and so on. And its implication for the national security, national resilience is enormous. So those are each strategic challenges that we have to deal with, and this year's Military Statesmen Forum also has addressed those issues. We just could not talk about everything, but we did. Cybersecurity, geoeconomics, certainly North Korea, and the others. The support from the active duty officers and incumbent government officials is indispensable to enrich the conversation and make the discussions at MSF relevant and meaningful. And we are very much fortunate that we had members from Joint Chiefs of Staff, Department of Defense, and National Security Council from the United States. And from Japanese side, we had members from the Self-Defense Forces, Ministry of Defense, and the Prime Minister's Office. Today, we have 4 top members of the Military Statesmen Forum. We have 2 co-chair of the Military Statesmen Forum, Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Ryoichi Oriki, a former Chief of Staff of Joint Staff Self-Defense Forces. And all of you know Admiral Dennis Blair, former PACOM commander and DNI chief, currently the chairman of the board of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. And General Shigeru Iwasaki, former Chief of Staff, Joint Staff, the Self-Defense Forces. So we are extremely lucky and privileged to have four of them to share their observations and their suggestions with all of you today. So I, once again, would like to express my deep gratitude to my friend, Michael Green, for chairing this and moderating this. Thank you. I hope you really enjoy that today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yoichi. We'll have a discussion up here on stage and then turn it over to the audience to ask questions, including, I hope, from some of the participants in the Military Statesmen Forum who are not on stage right now. Yoichi Funabashi has, if you know him, in classic form, come up with the right idea at the right time. There's never been anything quite like this Military Statesmen Forum, in part because on the Japanese side, there haven't been former chiefs of defense forces with the authority that these gentlemen had. So there was an opportunity to create this kind of forum given the broad, not only joint, but policy experience of the senior officers coming out of the top of the defense forces. But there's also more of a demand for this kind of dialogue. The threat environment, as Dr. Funabashi just said, is extremely complex. The U.S.-Japan alliance was an alliance that we generally for decades managed as a rear area support alliance for contingencies, particularly on the Korean Peninsula we were getting ready for, but now Japan's in the front lines. The North Korean threat, we heard today about another missile launch, puts Japan in the front line, essentially, with the North Korean threat. And the maritime challenges in the East China Sea and South China Sea from China are also right in Japan's front yard. So this is no longer an alliance that is primarily a rear area alliance for forward presence. It's in the front lines. That's changed Japanese politics, policy, strategic thinking, and it means that we on the US side have really a responsibility to understand how the threat looks and the challenges look up close from Japan, and that Japan is also one of our most important global partners now. The alliance, for decades we talked about as a global alliance, but I can tell you from my time in the NSC, beginning a decade ago, when we go into the G7 or G20 meetings, we're usually more aligned with Japan than any other country, including our closest allies. So it's more complex, it's more comprehensive, we have less relative money to spend, Japan's in the front line. All these point towards more integration, more jointness, more sharing of strategic assessments, and the group of distinguished former chiefs of defense forces and PACOM commanders and so forth are perfect to contribute to that dialogue. But most importantly, MSF, the Military Statesmen Forum, has established itself in Washington as a legitimate and important national security institution because it has a TLA, a three-letter acronym. And so MSF is, we know, going to play an important role going forward. Let me ask some questions to our panel, have some dialogue up here, and then we'll open it up. This was an off-the-record discussion, but I have permission from the organizers to ask a little bit about the discussion. I wanted to ask each of the admirals and generals on stage, what their major takeaway was. In general, over these 4 years of dialogue, and particularly from this meeting, what is the conclusion, the surprise, the imperative thing we must do that you took out of the meeting? And I'm going to start for this one, Admiral Blair, if it's all right, down on this end.
Sure.
With you, and we'll go this way, and then we'll do reverse order for the next question.
Well, I think when you're called a statesman, that's another word for old guy. And I'm going to take a little bit advantage of that to give a little bit of perspective on U.S.-Japan military relationship in my time. When I was the commander of a guided missile destroyer homeported in Yokosuka in the mid-1980s, when we were operating with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, we were required to leave port separately to make sure that we didn't communicate with the Japanese ship until we were beyond helicopter range of the coast of Japan, because a press helicopter would then not be able to see us steaming together and communicating. That was the state of the alliance in the 1980s. In the mid-1990s, I was involved in some joint planning with the Japanese self-defense forces. I was required to put on a suit, grow my hair a little bit longer, get rid of my shiny black shoes, and go in a small delegation into the basement of the old Japanese Defense Agency building in Roppongi in order to do some secret conversations with counterparts in the Japanese self-defense forces, and leave. And our greatest fear was again of a press leak of these operations. So to be able to sit in an open forum with cameras and an audience and talk about important issues of the U.S.-Japan alliance is just such a maturing of the alliance that we've seen in recent years that I don't think we should lose sight of the progress that's been made. And just in time, too, because the security situation in Northeast Asia, in East Asia, and overall in the world has become much more pressing, much more complicated than it ever has been. And the interests of our two countries are exactly aligned in terms of our vision of what we think East Asia should look like from the security, the economic, the governance, the values point of view. And that imperative has enabled us to be able to talk much more openly and honestly and freely about how we can pool our resources and we can pool our efforts in order to work together towards that kind of Asia. So what I have seen in the Military Statesmen Forum is an unprecedented level of frank discussion. The Japanese are famous for their politeness. The Americans are famous for their directness, and what that resulted in the past was a lack of serious communication to really talk about points of difference that had to be worked around and real understanding of points of convergence that should be emphasized. I would say that in the 4 years of this Military Statesmen Forum, we actually get down to honest appreciations of the constraints on both sides, of the ambitions on both sides, and then working towards common solutions. In the past 4 years, we've noticed and frankly acknowledged areas of divergence. The United States and Japan share common objectives on the major issues, but we're not the same country, and we don't live in exactly the same locations, and so we don't have exactly the same priorities. So there are differences, and these were frankly discussed, and we'll talk about some of those later in this discussion. We don't see Russia quite the same way. We in the past have had different interests with China. There are economic issues which are different among between the United States and China, between the United States and Japan, and our relations with China, and inevitably, at the highest level, major economic approaches and major security approaches overlap. So there have been those differences, but rather than being joked over or papered over, they are addressed in this forum, and we've been able to, I think, come up with ways to go forward, which we have then passed back to those who have the jobs that we used to have. Another one of our rules is to try to be helpful to those who have the jobs that we used to have, rather than making their lives more difficult. And I think we've been successful in that area. So let me stop there, Mike, as far as the sort of overall progress, and we will discuss the specific issues I know later.
Great, thank you. Admiral.
I would only comment, this is the third forum for me, 2 of them here and then 1 in Tokyo last year. I guess re-emphasize what Admiral Blair said in terms of just in time. I've also experienced the same evolution that Admiral Blair has over time in terms of our overall relationship. Always allies, but certainly constrained. And what I really admire about what Prime Minister Abe is doing now is looking for a way to have Japan represented in the 21st century security environment, and that's to both to move in that direction, and then to empower his retired senior officers to have some of that discussion, specifically. Oriki-san is here. I mean, he and I were in the same job at the same time, and in particular during the Fukushima Tomodachi disaster. It was actually, it was a validation, I think, of the alliance, the way that we were able to instantly support not just the self-defense forces, but the people of Japan. By virtue of that experience, the friendship and respect that we developed for each other, this forum came along a couple years later, so it was very easy to commit to it. Admiral Blair talked about the issues we've discussed in broad detail, and I'm sure we'll come to some of those. But I've also watched the discussion mature, very similar to the relationship. One of the individuals in the audience today is General Skip Sharp. Skip was the commander of the forces in South Korea when I was chairman as well. And starting last year and again this year, we've worked to try to create some version of a trilateral view with set with ROC views as well as Japan and the United States. And this year we had a former chief of defense there, General Jun, who contributed greatly, for example. And then from my perspective, when I try to understand a problem, I really do want to try to listen to the perspective from who I'm with. What are your concerns? How do you hear things? And this is a forum that's afforded us a great opportunity to listen to our good friends so that we can understand the challenges and then try to move forward together. So it's been more robust this year than last year than the year before that, and I think it will continue to be in what I think most of us in this room would understand or believe that it's an extraordinary time right now of uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, geo-economic uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, one of my beliefs is you need good friends, and we have one in Japan.
Thank you. General Oriki and General Iwasaki are going to speak in Japanese, so you may want to take a second to get your earphone. I don't know which channel is English. Is it 2? 2 is English, and 3 is Russian. If you're, So let me turn to General Oriki and just parenthetically add, he's going to come in. The other interesting thing about the timing of this forum is it began at a time when Japan's self-defense forces in public opinion polls in Japan emerged as the most trusted institution in Japan, which for post-war Japan is quite remarkable. So the role of senior military statesmen, and in Japan the idea of military statesmen is very new, or at least in post-war era. The idea they have a role in helping to frame this debate is new and timely. So, ということでお願いします。失礼しました。ありがとうございます。
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Oriki. So we're switching from English to Japanese. So this is not a weakness from Japanese people not learning English, but we do have a very strong alliance. I want to say that. So we just concluded our 4th MSF forum. And then I've been attending this from the first forum. Between the United States and Japan, we rotate the location between Tokyo and Washington, D.C. And so that means that last year, Japan hosted one forum in Tokyo. So Mr. Mullen talked about this earlier. So when I was in active duty, we had a similar job and also similar timing. Since then, we have been working on opinion exchanges and also trends analysis. So with him, I really experienced that kind of sharing of information. But now, we are coming here as representatives from the United States and also Japan. I thought that we had a really good communication, but through this kind of fora, I really experienced that there was a gap and then there's something that we need to address. And then again, from first forum to 4th forum, I think we're developing really good communication and also good information sharing. And then I think we're becoming together regarding what needs to be said to have really good communication. For our 4th forum, I want to say my personal impressions. First off, of course, that South China Sea and some other various security issues are there. But our topic was about geo-economics. And so what kind of economic implications are there to security issues? Dr. Green talked about North Korea, and there are not only military options. Okay, let me back up here. There are certain things that we would want from China or the relationship to Russia. There are some options, including sanctions, and so those are perspectives that we talked about. And also, there's a One Belt, One Road initiative in China. So when we look at that initiative, the Indian Ocean is very much integrated here, and then also the role for that of that ocean. So when we look at the Indian Ocean in terms of OBOR, so there is an economic implication to security. So that's something that I learned from everyone and also other experts that we had. So I think we had overall had really good communication. Thank you. Thank you. My name is Iwasaki. So to that same question, I think that since this is our 4th forum, I think we have went through many of the topics already. And also these panelists are really opinionated, so I think that I don't have very much to talk about anymore. But I think that my participation is about 3.5 times, not fully 4, not fully 3. My first participation was in, the first forum was in Tokyo, but I was still in active duty, so I could not fully attend to that first one. So that's what I meant by half a time participation. But after that, I really am appreciative of this forum since I was a self-defense force. So I'm from Air, Japanese self-defense force, and then also I had a tenure as a joint chief of staff. So looking back those times, I really spoke with my counterparts in the United States, but when I was in active duty, I felt that there was a gap in communication between the Japan side and the United States. So when I felt that, I reached out to Dr. Green and also Mr. John Hamre. When you and also John came to Japan, I was really able to talk to you to gain more perspectives. And then also I talked to you about the need of more active discussions.
Unfortunately, I had an opportunity to participate in this meeting hosted by Dr. Funabashi and Dr. Green, and I'm very happy about that. Japan and U.S. are two different countries, and therefore, regarding the issue pertaining to SDF or the U.S. forces or economic situation, what is legal, what is not legal, of course, there are the differences between the two countries. But this is the fourth round of the conference, and in the course of the four conferences, we have been discussing a lot of the discussions about wide-ranging issues, and the discussion conducted here will be submitted to the two governments and the U.S. forces. And for the SDF, I think we are able to give a lot of advice to those institutions, and therefore the deliverables on the accomplishment of the MSF is quite substantial.
One of the major topics of focus was North Korea, and it's in the news again this morning, as I mentioned. And it's one of the drivers of change in our alliance. 20 years ago, Japan was still largely in the rear area. Today, there are so many threats to Japan emanating directly from North Korea, missiles, cyber, and so forth, and now directly towards the American homeland. So that creates it creates the necessity of joint preparedness as allies between the U.S. and Japan, and of course with the ROK. It also creates the potential for fissures and different assessments of the threat. So I'd like to turn to North Korea, and I think we'll want to address, particularly for our American panelists, the role of the military instruments of power within our overall North Korea strategy. It's often said by experts that the military option is not realistic. General Dunford at Aspen this week said it's not off the table. That's important for Japan, of course, but I'd like to ask our American panelists about that. I think it'll be interesting to hear about the progress on trilateral cooperation with Korea, and in particular the Japan-Korea piece of that, and how ready we are, and where we need to be more ready to deal with contingencies emanating from North Korea, including not only attack, but also collapse or provocations. There's a range of threats now that we have to think about. So let me start, Iwasaki-san, with you, but I'm going to sort of direct certain questions. And yes, please. Yeah, sorry, you got no rest. So generally, you're thinking about North Korea, but also specifically, I'm interested in your view on the Japan-Korea piece of this, and how ready is Japan? Clearly not enough, but what are the areas where Japan, together with the U.S. and Korea, has to make more efforts to be prepared for this growing challenge?
Thank you very much. Whether I should call it good timing or bad timing, but there was a launch of the ICBM by North Korea that was reported. But when we consider the DPLK in 1998, the sky over Japan, there was a flight, and there was some the ballistic missile launched over Japan. But whether it was successful or not, but in any case, the range of 2,000 kilometers, something was launched by North Korea then. Even prior to that, we had a lot of different information. And for the ballistic missile, Japan needed the equipment. That's what we claimed. But there was a time that Japanese people in general did not accept that. In 1998, there was a ballistic missile which flew over Japan. But after that, there was a much better understanding about this necessity. And BMD system should have been deployed earlier. But since then, for instance, we had an Aegis and PAC-3. And the systematic operation has become possible. In other words, ground-based network has been put in place. And therefore, as a result, I think our BMD system is quite ready. And naturally, in order to cope with the North Korea or BMD situation around Japan in a Pacific, the fleet, the 7th Fleet is deployed. And therefore, together with the Aegis of the 7th Fleet, we have exchange of data, and we share the information together in order to step up our the preparedness. And as was mentioned by Dr. Green, now, of course, naturally, when we think about response to North Korea, not only the ballistic missile, but when the conflict happens, without the ROK, we cannot go anywhere. Very difficult to take any measures without the South Korea. Maybe your perception is Japan-Korea relations, South Korea the relations are not favorable, but politically, unfortunately, that is true. And there was ups and downs of the relations between Japan and South Korea, but I have been working at the SDF, and then I became the chief of staff. And during that period, the air, sea, the ground of the South Korea, I think we have had always good relations, military basis, and political relations sometimes is different. And so in terms of the personal exchange, Blue House or presidential office, if they turn down the request, the military members of the Korea could not come and we could not visit them. However, there has been the good collaboration between Japanese and the Korean forces, and GSOMIA issue has been discussed, and we have been making the efforts to conclude. And we came to the very close to conclusion, but that was frozen. But between Japan and South Korea, finally, GSOMIA has been put in place. And the exercise, the frequency is not very high, but the majority of them are maritime exercise. But recently, the BMD trilateral, the information exchange training was carried out among Japan-U.S. and the South Korea. So trilateral relations are bound to develop from now. And for the first time in this MSF conference, of course, response to North Korea, we have had a lot of information exchange between Japan and the United States. And the General Sharp has been involved in this conference recently. And for this year, we invited the General John from the Korea, the ROK. And Korean side perception has been provided from him. And I believe that that is such a valuable opportunity to listen to the South Korean view. And having his view, he returned to South Korea yesterday, but Japan ROK relations or trilateral Japan-U.S. ROK relations will be further strengthened as a result. Well, started from BMD, but in 2009, at the end of March, I became the chief of staff of Joint Staff of the JSDF, and Tepodon too. The over Japan actually reached the Pacific. I still remember that happened in 2009. That was just 10 days after I took the office, and I come from Army, the ground self-defense forces, and therefore, so I made my best efforts. And for the Yonpyeong-do, the shelling, and Cheonam, the patrol boat was destroyed by North Korea. And so many different incidents took place during that year. And as Dr. Green mentioned, if you can look at the situation, Japan has already become the player of the front line. But I should say that Japan has been on the front line for a long time. Scud and Tepodon, Nodon, in terms of range, they reach Japan. And therefore, what we have to think, or what we should have thought from then, was the rocket used the solid fuel. And so now, because of the launcher, we do not know where North Korea would launch. And so there are so many the upgrading of the capability of North Korea, and ICBM should be taken into our consideration, and the longer range is achieved. So Japan and U.S. have to deal with this. So the threat has existed, and I think in this respect we should have been more sensitive. But now the threat has been even the higher. And between Japan and the ROK, I think there is some optimism within Japan. The Prime Minister Abe and the new president, the president of the ROK, had a meeting, and should be future-oriented. In other words, particularly in the area of security, the joint statement was issued to look at the future. And for the security, I think we have some optimism between Japan and ROK. But the military matters are very often influenced by political situation. Of course, the military comes under the political situation. And Haiti, for the PKO, Japan and ROK both dispatched the units. And the SDF and the Korean forces were deployed in Haiti. And there was some work to create the school together. And SDF and the Korean forces worked together on the same site. And Korean forces, they used a truck. And on that truck, the JSDF members just put the debris. So we work together on the same site. And therefore, that type of the relation should be further strengthened, reinforced. And the fact that we are able to reach that state, the trilateral, the relations will be even strengthened. And so I'm already retired, but I would like to continue to make efforts.
Same issue, but in particular, given your previous job, I think it'd be interesting for everyone to hear your thoughts on the role of military options, military instruments in the larger North Korea strategy. And the press debate and a lot of the academic debate posits a binary choice. You either preemptively bomb them or you engage in a dialogue and give them lots of stuff. And as you know well, of course, there's a whole range of options and contingencies and so forth. So it'd be helpful if you could also frame for us the role of the military power in dealing with the North Korea problem going forward.
Actually, Admiral Blair and I talked about this in terms of this possibility coming up, and
you volunteered him?
Yeah, I volunteered him to at least take the lead, and I'll fill in behind.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. If you were to listen to our discussion, if you were to read the press about the current North Korean issue, it's as if it's a standoff between the DPRK and the United States, with the other countries of Northeast Asia being sort of the backdrop against which this occurs. If you listen to our discussions within the within this conference over the last 3 days, you realize that this is an alliance problem, a problem for an issue that the United States, its two allies, Japan and the Republic of Korea, have to face. And that, I think, puts a little different light on it. We need to evaluate our options in dealing with North Korea in terms of their effect on our alliances. We want to emerge at the end of whatever happens with our alliance with Japan and our alliance with the Republic of Korea and their relationships with each other being stronger than they were, not weakened, much less completely dissolved by them. So I think we have to keep, and what I was reminded in our discussions, in mind that this is a complex alliance challenge, not just a mano a mano between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And so I think that's really an important thing. As we discuss the specifics of the issues, I think we had some insights which might be useful. When I was the Pacific commander and the temperature went up on the peninsula, it was pretty much a peninsula problem. The General Sharp's predecessor, who was the commander of Combined Forces Command, would put his command on the higher alert. A series of well-understood measures focused on the peninsula would happen, and we were up on our toes and leaning forward in the peninsula. Now, if there is an elevated level of tension and potential for military action, whether it be by North Korea or whether we are considering military options in the United States, that affects a wide range of defense preparations in Korea, in Japan, and in the United States. Not only are they missile defense preparations, but for example, they're cyber preparations that both countries have to make. They are much more extensive maritime and air defense preparations. And so the part of any serious military option that comes up in that region has to be a very careful set of preparations by all three countries to defend their citizens and their interests in case North Korea decides to take aggressive action. That can only be done by not minutes of notification, but weeks of careful consultation and planning. So I think what you would hear from the military professionals is whatever you're going to do militarily in dealing with Korea, all three countries have to be involved. There has to be time for them to be ready to deal with a full range of possible reactions. Two other sets of insights we gained on some of the non-military tools with which we are dealing with North Korea. The first is the sanctions regime. To make a generalization, we have been pretty much using simple straight stick sanctions to deal with North Korea. They haven't had the intensity of exquisite intelligence focus, cooperation with the private sector, understanding of the network that Korea has developed in order to take advantage of the gray market, not understanding the corresponding organization within China, which is taking advantage of Korean desires to import illegal goods, to make money, and to cooperate with North Korea. We need a much more tighter, focused effort involving the intelligence agencies and, in many cases, the commercial and financial authorities in the United States, Japan, Republic of Korea, and China. And I think that China can be far more effective if we do not just point the finger at them and say, up to you, China, but that we involve the Chinese authorities who have very aggressive tools for dealing with corruption, which is a huge feature in the trade with Korea, for dealing with counterfeiting, which is a huge feature. The North Koreans are not only counterfeiting dollars, they are counterfeiting yen, they are counterfeiting renminbi. They are dealing with drugs in a way that is affecting those who live west of the Yalu as well as east of the Yalu. And so the idea of both intensifying and internationalizing in a detailed way the sanctions regime on North Korea is, I think, an important insight that we can improve. And the final one that we all who have dealt with North Korea for a long time is I think we have not done nearly as well as we could in terms of pushing information into North Korea so that both the elites who are around the Kim regime and more general citizenry can understand just how bad they have it and can understand that they are not, in fact, the subject of an aggressive campaign from outside. Estimates are that up to a fifth of citizens of North Korea now have access to a cell phone now, and that's a tremendous opportunity for getting into information into North Korea. There are many other opportunities, and although there have been sporadic attempts by particularly the Republic of Korea and to a lesser extent the United States to push information into North Korea, I think we can certainly ramp that up as well. So I think those were the main insights that we had on North Korea in terms of both being in a better military posture, increasing the information flow into the country, and working with China in a way that has all of us working on these sanctions rather than simply wagging our finger at them. Thanks.
So what to do? Anybody that's followed this knows, I mean, usually whoever's talking about it will say there are no good options. And there really are no good options here. One of the things that I was struck with in our discussions was, which is a little bit obvious, and I've been concerned broadly about this, but when you look at the number of missile tests that Kim Jong-un has generated in his relatively brief time, it's an extraordinarily high number compared to his predecessors. And in fact, there's a view, and we talked about this in the forum, that while his dad and his granddad may have had a more calculating purpose of the launches, his purpose very clearly is to get a nuclear weapon on top of an ICBM as soon as possible. And if you read in the media, certainly of late, there's a pretty strong belief that's going to happen sooner than we predicted as recently as 6 months ago. You combine that with the fact that he has eliminated not just his uncle, but any other threat, his half-brother, and look at the numbers of people that he has eliminated in his regime at a pace that far exceeds his predecessors as well. Given not just what he's doing, but the pace he's actually executing it at, so what are we going to do? And specifically, so Michael, you asked about the military options. There are no good military options. In addition to being no good options, there are no good military options. And probably what is, for those of us that understand what some of those options might be, it is the catastrophic outcome of those options, the potential that is there if it were a preemptive strike, for example, on what's going to happen to Seoul, what's going to happen on the peninsula, what do we get ourselves into. What I believe with respect to Kim Jong-un is I don't think he's suicidal at this point. At least that's my judgment. And so he is, like many dictators around the world, going to try to figure out a way to sustain being in charge in that country. So the idea that he would actually launch one of these weapons on South Korea, Japan, or on the U.S. is, again, that would be suicide for him and his regime. I still believe, and you see discussion now about, well, first of all, when you see what our president has said here in the United States, which has been very strong, what General Dunford said, I think, last week at Aspen, which was focused on not taking military options off the table, that there's clearly we're going to pressure him as hard as we can to a point where he possibly makes the decision this isn't worth it. That's one path. It may or may not work. Another path is through China. And everybody up here, Denny and I and our our successors have all worked this issue at one time or another. The answer isn't absolutely through Beijing, but Beijing doesn't, from my perspective, doesn't, shouldn't, can't get a free pass on this. It's too dangerous for them as well. Moving in that direction in support of figuring out how to put pressure on this guy to make sure that there is not a disaster, I think, is key. But again, it's not, it's been ground that has previously been plowed and it's been unsuccessful. And so what are the Chinese interests here? And how do we match up our interests with our allies' interests, with Chinese interest, and figure out where the overlap might be so that we could prevent this disaster? And I just reemphasize what Admiral Blair said, is this isn't just about the United States and North Korea. This is about two great friends, two great alliances, and it is in the breadbasket of the world. 4 of the 5 biggest economies in the world are centered out there, and in one part of the discussion, even as we postured what might happen in terms of preparation, the first response from someone was the financial markets are going south immediately. And we all talk about that. We know that it's going to have any outbreak there would have a huge economic, financial impact globally. But to hear somebody say it as part of that, yes, we would expect and have to plan for this in this kind of form, was a little bit jarring and probably a little bit more real given what's going on as recently as today with another test.
You actually ended up taking the harder half. So
Pardon?
You ended up taking the harder half of the questions.
Oh, well, I mean, that's...
Thank you. Before we offer the audience a chance to weigh in, I want to ask about something I don't think you did address, and that is the significance of U.S. forward military presence in the Western Pacific. I don't want to get a Japanese and U.S. perspective, anyone or everyone. The polling, public opinion polling in support of U.S. forces in Japan is pretty good in both countries, generally. But there are voices arguing, for example, in the U.S., that it's a mistake to have some of our best military assets within the missile range envelope of some of our potential adversaries. And then you have in Japan still in Okinawa, a challenging political situation, may not be getting worse, but it's not getting that much better, perhaps. I'd be interested in anyone's view of how you see, or how you would characterize the importance of our forward presence in Japan in light of some of the changes that are causing some people to argue we should rethink it. Do you want to start, Denny?
Sure. When I was SINCPAC in 2000 or so, had a little bumper sticker, West is best. It's much better to have your forces up there where the trouble might start and thereby keep it from starting. And if it does start, you can apply them more quickly. All the talk about vulnerability and so on, with the memories of Pearl Harbor and when we moved the American fleet from the west coast of the United States to Hawaii, and then it was vulnerable, is useful to think about. But the degree of intelligence and warning that we have, the understanding of the political situation, makes me think that we will not be, our forces would not be caught in their hangars at their pier in some kind of surprise attack, and that they ought to be there so that they can shape the environment rather than simply react to it. So I think it's much better to have our troops there. Another important function they serve is that the coin of the realm in terms of commitment is forces there, and those in Japan and those in Korea who face threats in a much shorter range than we in Washington or Washington State face, know that there are American troops there, and they are we're all in it together. So I think both for the reassurance point and for the deterrence point, and I can tell you from the warfighting point, forward is better, west is best.
Just quickly, two thoughts. One is, and I think it was President Xi in China. If it wasn't, it may have been his predecessor. But at one point, the Chinese leader said, "This is a big ocean, the Pacific. You know, you just take the eastern half, we'll take the western half." And my response to that is, we're not going anywhere. We've enjoyed a level of stability in that part of the world since 1953. And it hasn't just happened. It's been a lot of work. These alliances are part of that. Our presence is a big part of that. So it is, I think, incredibly important for us to be there across the board. And I'm reminded, or would remind those listening, it's 28,500 troops in South Korea. We've got 54,000 troops in Japan, and rightfully so. The other thing, from a warfighting standpoint, I want my best foot forward. I want my best forces there. They understand their vulnerabilities, they understand the weaknesses. They spend a lot of time mitigating those challenges. And I want anybody that is there to understand they are our best forces and that they are the forces we integrate with in Japan and with Korean forces. We practice it all the time. And there is, one of the things we did talk about in this forum was the readiness. And they're ready. They're ready. They're forward. They know it. They're the best we've ever had, and I'm very confident in them.
So maybe my perspective is a little bit different. Strategically speaking, if there's a unit withdrawing and also rotating out to a different location, there are different perspectives in terms of operation and also missions. In terms of operation, if we are to move a base, that sends a big signal to other countries. And so let's say relationships between Korea and the United States and Japan and the United States, if we are to move a base, then that means a big disrupt between those relationships, and that sends a big signal to the rest of the world. And I think that we are in a preparation phase or planning phase that we should be in deep consideration to consider what kind of presence that we are in need of right now. Let's say the Japanese and U.S. relationship, we will need a significant strategic dialogue or meeting. With that forum, we should review what kind of roles and responsibilities each country should have or will have. Without that kind of careful consultation between those two countries, and I think we're going to make a big mistake. I think the three panelists already talked about many of my opinions, so I don't have very much to say. But if we are to realign or replace the United States forces from Japan or from Asia, I think that this is a signal that we're taking a weaker position to the rest of the world. And for example, the United States goes to Korea and also Japan. As armed forces, we have alliances and also treaties and agreements. And I think the most important thing is training and also exercises. So if we have a long distance between two countries, that means that we need to have a one or two big exercises once in a while. So coordination becomes less and less. So by having actual U.S. forces physically in our territory, that means we can communicate closely. And also that technical transfer becomes more often and also more active. So that's why having physical presence in Japan is really critical and also important to us. And then so 5 years ago, there was a meeting with a whole of air defense commands. You might not know about this command, but this one has a war-fighting capability, meaning that aircraft fighters and then also PAC-3 and some other war-fighting functions. And so we have 50,000 airmen, but half of it actually belong to this command. And so this command takes the BMD's command in Japan. And so meaning that we have a warning leader function under his command, and also a maritime Aegis ship is actually belong to this command itself. So there's a liaison kind of function here. So we had different commands, separate commands between Japan and the United States, but we moved this air integrated command in Yokota because we wanted to have the same physical base sharing together. And so meaning that the United States command and also the Japanese command, they can share the same information to make decisions. I think that this shows the progress between the Japan and the United States alliance and also defense cooperation. And the recent missile launches from North Korea. So we're ready to monitor those launches and testing from North Korea together with the United States. And I think that so moving a base is not light decisions to make.
Thank you. I appreciate that from all four of you, because I think from time to time we have to recharge those batteries and make this argument and explain it in a different context. And I agree with what all of you said. Actually, the environment we face and the limited resources we have make this forward presence even more important. And for it to be effective in terms of deterrence and dissuasion, shaping the environment, we will have to be more joint, combined, interoperable in our bilateral alliances, and our bilateral alliances will have to be better able to operate together, as some of you said, in certain scenarios. I think one of the North Koreans' targets in terms of the center of gravity with this missile program, one of the reasons they're doing it, is to try to split our alliances, to try to get decoupling, by threatening the U.S., stress the bilateral alliance with Japan and Korea. And the answer to that is we become more joint, more committed. And in a very different way, I think China's goal over the longer term, and the tell or the sort of indicator of that was Xi Jinping's speech in 2014 when he said the future of Asia should have no blocks, meaning no alliances. I think in a longer, sort of less immediate threatening way, but nevertheless in a long-term way, I think China's center of gravity is also to gradually see our alliances get weaker. If we want to motivate China a little bit more on North Korea, we have to demonstrate that North Korea's actions are actually making our alliances more joint, coming together. So both to be able to ready to fight tonight, is that the saying in Korea, Skip? To be ready, but also for the larger geopolitical game, we got to be more forward, more capable, more joint, as you all said, and I think that's important. Let me open it to the audience. I didn't ask about China so that somebody can say, you didn't ask about China, or not. There are a lot of issues on the table and a lot of issues that were discussed, including cyber and others. Mr. Nelson. We have microphones.
Right, good.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Thanks as always for a terrific discussion.
Chris, where from?
The Nelson Report. And in my old age, Admiral Blair helped me become respectable. I'm a fellow at the Saskatchewan Peace Foundation, so thank you for that. There's hope for us all. From a military standpoint, there's a political issue potentially looming. At some point, were you still in your prior positions, you would be asked, should we negotiate a freeze with these guys? Should we negotiate a peace treaty that inherently accepts them as nuclear powers? from your military standpoint, what would that mean? What would be the downsides to it? What would be the upsides to it? Because you could see where we might be coming to that. If it's true, as General Sharp says, you know, it's too late to stop these guys except by military means, which is unacceptable. And as our friend Scott Snyder said for years, I don't see a happy ending here. You know, you can see where we're facing this now with the ICBM crisis. What's your response to the dilemma that I'm putting out? If you're asked, what is the military response to freezes, to peace treaties, to accepting these guys as a nuclear power, what would you say?
So you're, to help the audience and some of our panelists from Japan, you're asking about a U.S. DPRK peace treaty or freeze.
Well, and we're including that, especially given the context of this really good discussion. This is an alliance problem, isn't it? If we're running around making an individual treaty with the Norks, our friends in Seoul and our friends in Tokyo are going to have something to say about it.
So it'd be interesting to hear from Admirals Blair and Mullen, but also the Japanese view.
Thanks very much.
Japanese view on what a U.S. DPRK peace treaty or freeze would mean. But we'll start with one of you two gentlemen.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of freeze proposals in the air right now. There was the interesting Chinese proposal in which they said that if North Korea would freeze its missile and nuclear program, the United States and the Republic of Korea should freeze their exercise program. And as far as I can tell, the only benefit to that arrangement would be to China, which makes a lot of sense because it was China that proposed it. They would not only degrade the military capability of the United States in the Western Pacific, but they'd also slow down the North Korean nuclear development, which they don't much like anyhow. So the Chinese freeze, I think, is transparently self-serving and is something that we ought to reject. I think before you go into negotiations with the North Koreans, you should do a little bit of your history work. And many friends of mine, many acquaintances, many predecessors of mine have been involved in negotiations with the North Koreans, and their record for negotiating in good faith, their record for carrying out their commitments once they've actually signed them and agreed to them is abysmal.
Actually, it's perfect.
That's
Perfect.
It's very consistent.
Perfectly abysmal, yeah. So I just think that it reminds you of that American cartoon of Charlie Brown kicking the football that Lucy holds in place for him, and she just pulls it away every single time, and he falls flat on his back every time. I'm just a little jaded on the negotiation, the method, unless there is some reality behind it in terms of an improved military situation, something that would lead you to believe that North Korea was now more serious. So I tend to discount those. I think we should examine each one, look at the surrounding conditions to see if something has changed that would encourage us to do that. But I'm basically deeply skeptical about all of them.
I'd only add two thoughts. One is, no matter what we happen, and given the batting record for negotiating directly with the North, as a perfect 0-0-0, that we need to move forward in consultation with our allies specifically, and then it gets me back to, if there's any possibility here, I think it is creating opportunities with China to then have all of us move to something with North Korea that is almost sewn up ahead of time by everybody, what we agree on, then the discussions, and with China not sitting in the second row, but leading at the table to generate possible peaceful outcomes. That's what we all want. And what the specifics of that would be, I'm not sure. That's certainly one path, but I have a tendency to agree with Denny on this. I think going direct is fruitless based on the empirical data that's out there.
General Ricky, Kentucky.
I did not understand the question that well, unfortunately, but so far, with regard to North Korea, well, although we actually provided the thing something, but the North Korean the development has continued. And second time, although there was a crisis, for instance, six-party talks and other things took place, but in terms of the result, there was no good the result, and the North Korea continued to develop the nuclear weapons. So that should be the lesson that we learned out of our experiences. And North Korea, the safety of the country and the revival of the regime, I think that is a maximum the requirement for them. In America, they say yes. And in exchange for that, with condition, the denuclearization is important. But that has not been successful. The dilemma has continued. So one side must compromise, otherwise there is no solution. And therefore, in an ideal world, the U.S.-North Korea agreement would be very difficult. I don't know whether I answered the question perfectly, but that's my view. I think my view is very similar, but if I might misunderstand, but if you look at the world, there are countries which are trustworthy, and there are the countries which are not trustworthy. And so if you look at the track record of the North Korea, even though there is a promise, the promise is likely to be broken by North Korea. In some way or the other, they try to earn time, or they try to accumulate their fund, and they tend to take the very similar action. And so in order to have them make a promise, irreversible condition should be defined clearly in order to move ahead. In any case, for North Korea, for ballistic missile and the nuclear, the purpose of the development is the survival of the regime. And in order to ensure the survival of the regime, China may be needed, but I think the final goal is an association with the United States. And since that is the ultimate purpose, and for that reason, they want to be a nuclear the country or the launching of the ICBM. And so the purpose of the North Korea and the reversible the conditions, I think that those two should be kept in our mind in order to deal with that.
As you don't rule out the military option, as horrible as it is, you don't rule out the diplomatic option, but you, on the other hand, don't invest in that diplomatic option everything,
Right.
because you
Long
don't
spoon.
you
Use a
don't
long-
put everything on that bet, because we know from experience it almost certainly won't work, and the design of this freeze for freeze is to weaken our deterrence and weaken our alliances. Is that a fair summation? Yes, sir.
Lloyd Hand, King and Spalding, and I agree with the other gentlemen. It's been a wonderful overview. Extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. So what I'm about to raise is a question. It's clear it is going to be extraordinary, but don't take that as a defense, particularly for our Japanese friends. It's clear from just what you've said and what one reads that there are no easy nor good, they're all bad military options. And if you assume, as we read over and over again, and I haven't heard anything different here, that the North Koreans' objective is to secure a nuclear capability that will enable them to secure maximum leverage for its threat of use. That's what they want. And nothing seems to deter it. And if you look at it from that perspective and buy it, why would they? Why would negotiations or threat? They seem to have sufficient military capability to threaten South Korea particularly, that makes that a difficult military division. And why would they initiate a conventional military operation? Because worst case, that could bring a nuclear retaliation, and ultimately. I'm not sure this is accurate. You all probably would know, but I understand Fred Kemp has come out with a recent book that says that Kennedy in the early 60s was confronted with a probability of Soviet encirclement of our allies and made the decision to use our nuclear capability, calculating it was a loss of 1 million on either side. It was an extraordinary measure, extraordinary times. I'm sure that in the bowels of Pentagon and other calculations, they're looking at trade-offs like that. But isn't it going to be necessary among these bad options to prevent North Korea from achieving its objective at some point? Because it's not going to get any easier. Now, back to the extraordinary measure. In this calculation, it seems at the moment at least, China has the greatest leverage and is unwilling to use it. Maybe in minor ways, counterfeit, corruption, but it's not going to affect the overall calculation. But if this were a possibility to bring pressure on China, given all the historic restraints for historic reasons, would Japan consider developing a nuclear capability? Because clearly, that's going to signal to China, this could have complications for us. That's my question.
So this is what Charles Krauthammer argued a day or two ago in the Washington Post, that the only way out of this is to encourage Japan, and I think he also added the Republic of Korea to develop nuclear weapons, an idea I recall hearing on the campaign trail last year as well at one point. Is it fair to ask you to respond? Why not? You faced more difficult missions in the past.
Really?
So let me answer the question. The first, the North Korea, ICBM or nuclear, the armament has been developed because they do not have any trust in the other countries. And therefore, unless they are armed, equipped with nuclear the capability, they cannot feel assured. I think that seems to be a motivation. And also, of course, the development of the nuclear arms are very problematic. But if you look at the world situation, or if you look at the relation of North Korea with the rest of the world, the nuclear proliferation or technological proliferation, of course, the threat of nuclear, but there are other kinds of threat that's spreading throughout the world. And to Japan, to the United States, worldwide, I think this is a very unfavorable situation, very extraordinary situation. And in that sense, and the United States now, for instance, every option is on the table. And so that is the reason I think that every option is on the table. And the other point, the nuclear option issue. For about a week ago, there was the opinion poll by private the organization about allocate in Japan, whether nuclear armament is necessary, and allocate 70% of the public say that they need to have the nuclear armament, and Japanese answer is only 9%. Only 9% say that Japan should be armed with nuclear weapons. I think that is a result of the poll, and I checked that with the newspaper report. And so about Japan, in terms of national sentiment, in a genuine about the security, I think the different the result may come out. But if you look at the national sentiment, rather than going to the nuclear, the alliance with United States, etc. So other types of deterrence seems to be called for by Japan. And so maybe I think that is more clever the option. If military
Fired anymore. So thank you. Others want to weigh in? Or?
I just think we should remember, Lloyd, that this is not a new dilemma that has been faced. When in the battle Cold War years, when the United States had a huge military, a huge nuclear arsenal, Soviet Union had one, the countries that were caught in between adopted different forms of their own nuclear deterrence or reassurance. France and the UK decided that they wanted to have their own systems, and they developed them. Germany, Turkey, Norway, other countries decided that they would rely on the American deterrent, but it wasn't simply a declarative reliance. There were techniques such as dual-capable aircraft, in which American weapons could be delivered by aircraft flown by German or Turkish or Danish pilots. There was the stationing of American shorter ranges systems forward. So there's a whole range of things that have been developed in order to reassure an ally that the United States nuclear umbrella extends over them without them developing weapons. And we actively have discussions with these at the in official channels with Japan and the Republic of Korea. So I think your principle of our allies having nuclear reassurance is absolutely correct. And then I think it's up to the allies to decide where along that spectrum, from having their own arsenal to a series of intermediate measures to simply relying on American declaratory policy, do they want to? And as North Korea develops its capabilities, its delivery capabilities, and the weapons themselves, I think this conversation will take place, agreements will be reached, and the countries will still be secure.
I want to make sure I'm going to try not to get in trouble when I say this. But I think, and it goes back to what Admiral Blair said earlier, which is oftentimes, and certainly lately, this is portrayed as just the U.S. and North Korea. And it has taken on a particular intensity because of the ICBM potential, which is now much more real. But we focus on that, and what I worry about is sometimes we forget, that South Korea and Japan are already under the threat envelope in terms of missile capability. There's certainly the development of the nuclear warhead. And that from an alliance standpoint, we have a responsibility to include them in these discussions and not almost de facto isolate them from them because we're getting into this debate about us and North Korea. We have responsibility there. I recognize, that now that it's U.S. citizens that could be under the threat here very, very soon, but I think it's a responsibility for all leaders, American leaders in particular, to speak to our requirements vis-a-vis the alliance. And a forum like this for 3.5 days is a fresh reminder of the importance of that alliance. And I think Michael said it earlier, that even after something really bad happens, that alliance is stronger. It's not broken up because what we did or didn't do. And sometimes we have a tendency to not make that kind of consideration given sort of the short-term nature of, right now. Japanese people, South Korean people are already well under a threat envelope that they've been dealing with, quite frankly, for some time. Not nuclear, but on the conventional side, very, very dangerous and lethal. And we shouldn't forget that as a part of how we move forward as this gets more difficult.
That's a critical point. I can't resist, but 3 quick reasons why it's a really bad idea. And a decade ago, I was a senior Asia person on the NSC staff in the Bush administration, and very, very senior people just south of the president himself wanted to use this gambit of warning Japan would go nuclear. Bad idea it's a bad idea first, because we have more than enough deterrent power ourselves. We don't need it to deter or, if necessary, destroy North Korea. Number 2, if the North Korean aim, and in a longer term sense, the Chinese aim is to weaken our alliances, why would we introduce into the narrative the idea that we don't trust Japan, they don't trust our nuclear umbrella? It goes completely against the tool we have to start dealing with the problem, which is greater cooperation, greater alliance solidarity. And number 3, China's not going to listen to us. We could go in and tell the Chinese that Japan or Korea will go nuclear. They're going to make their own judgments. They've been living alongside Japan and Korea for a lot longer than we have. They're not going to listen to us. What they're going to hear is U.S.-Japan alliance is really in trouble because the Americans are talking about Japan going nuclear, or the U.S.-Korea alliance is really in trouble because the Americans are. That's the signal we'd send. So, now, if there's doubt about the credibility of our extended deterrent because we're now under threat, then as Admiral Mullen put very well, then we need to deepen the dialogue and think through how we restore a greater measure of credibility. But that's a far different thing, I think. Thanks for indulging me.
Just add one more point, Mike. A nuclear attack on either the Republic of Korea or Japan would kill lots of Americans. So an ICBM reaching Los Angeles would kill more Americans, but we are already subject to North Korean nuclear threats equally, have many of our citizens bearing equal exposure and vulnerability as our Japanese and Korean allies. And I think that is one of the strongest parts of the deterrent equation that exists.
It's a provocative question, but it's a good discussion to elucidate. Yes, in the front.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen, member of the Reagan Foundations. I have a couple questions.
Can you, 2 max?
Yeah.
So we're getting up to the hour.
Okay.
Thanks.
Since we have generals here, how can we defend Seoul? Are we ready to defend? Because it doesn't take nuclear weapon to destroy Seoul. More importantly, how can we defend Okinawa, where there's a bunch of U.S. bases there? How can we do that? It's a military question. Thanks.
Okay, what?
Hand the mic to that guy right there, 3 seats over. General Sharp.
To General Sharp, President.
So the defense of Seoul counts upon the combined forces of the Republic of Korea and the United States. And what Korea has along the border that's organized there to do counter-battery fire, the air forces that are there both from the Republic of Korea and from the United States, there would still, if today, North Korea started immediately pulling the lanyards and artillery rounds started coming in, there would be great damage in Seoul. But we would relatively quickly be able to destroy that artillery through ground, air, and naval fire. I don't want to minimize it, but there are very solid plans, very solid capabilities to be able to quickly react to any sort of attack from artillery coming into Seoul that are very well rehearsed many, many times. So it would be the end of Kim Jong-un if he started that. I'm absolutely convinced because we would not stop there. And
for those watching a podcast who don't know, General Skip Sharp, who was commander of, as the Admiral said, commander of all our forces on the Korean Peninsula.
And all the Korean forces on
all the Korean forces in his CFC, UNC hat. Thank you.
Do you want to do the Tokyo one?
Yeah, can we defend Okinawa where? Another.
You did say generals, not admirals.
So Chip Gregson was commander of many things, but 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force based in Okinawa and lived there.
And there's a little bit of revenge going on here. I told General Sharp he was going to get put on the spot, so then he hands the mic to me. Thank you. The defense of Okinawa would be the same as the defense of the mainland, air and ballistic missile defense, cruise missile defense, using the full weight of U.S. and Japanese forces. More and more is planned. There's already a battalion-sized unit, more or less, going into Miyako-jima. Japanese forces are already done in Yonaguni-jima. The posture is getting stronger over time, and unless there's some miraculous parting of the skies and the situation gets better, our alliance is going to get stronger to defend the territory, the interest, and the lives of our Japanese allies.
It's a very, very big thing to attack the United States of America or a treaty ally. That's a huge, huge thing. And you know, the public discussion, we get nervous, but we need to remember what a huge thing that is and the consequences that any adversary would think about. This is not some ambiguous gray zone. We're talking about it's two of our most important treaty allies and economic partners and like-minded democracies. Other questions? We have one more in the front. Matthew, if you.
Thank you. Steve Winters, independent researcher. Just sort of a follow-up on the question that was just addressed. I did go to a talk by one expert on North Korea who suggested that even if the regime were destroyed and the artillery was taken care of, that actually the plan of the North Koreans they have would be to go even in a decapitated state to go to a massive guerrilla and partisan war using their whole population, and that this would not resolve itself in months. It would go on for years. You'd sort of have a Libyan situation, perhaps. So, is anybody else addressing that issue? The assumption seems to be the military option is terrible. Oh, maybe 1 million people will be killed, or how many million? But that it'll be over in some sense, horrible as it is. But this suggestion was it won't be over.
Would you hand the mic to that guy on your right?
So again, as was talked about, I think that it is very important that we look at getting information into the people of North Korea about what potentially could be the future, what human rights is about, how their government is treating them, but mainly what human rights is about, but look at it from their eyes, from the perspective of North Korean people. Without going into the classified plans or anything, how do we, if something happened and we had to go north, there was instability, we had to go north, how do we make sure that the people, first off, are secured? How are they taken care of? And how do we get this word to them as quickly as possible about the truth about what we're really about? It's not easy. Much more work needs to be done on it. It is part of the plans that we do that. I think that with the more and more cell phones that are there, the more and more USB sticks that are getting into North Korea, the more ways to communicate across. Again, it's not going to be easy, but it is necessary, because if we don't, and South Korea doesn't, and Japan doesn't, if we don't work this, the scenario you're just describing of insurgencies and going to the hills and fighting for a long time, I do fear is really going to happen because of what North Korea people have been told, and I believe what they truly believe today.
So we, as General Sharp knows well and helped make possible, we plan for this with our Korean allies. It isn't perfect. We're not perfectly aligned, but we plan for it. We try to talk to the Chinese about it. That's very, very difficult. But it's important for Japan as well. What happens if the North collapses or becomes unstable? And I don't think we do enough official and unofficial dialogue with our Japanese allies about what this scenario would mean for Japan. So I like General Oriki and or General Iwasaki to weigh in on the Japanese perspective. Yeah. These panels are different from normal panels because the panelists can order each other based on seniority to answer the questions. I'm still getting used to the
It wasn't
dynamic.
an order, it was just a suggestion.
Guidance, guidance.
But just like yesterday, my junior controls senior. That's the problem. Well, I'm the senior to Mr. Iwasaki. Well, once the North Korea collapses, then what happens? I think this is my personal view, that if the internal conflict continues there, that's one possibility. And then what's the cause of collapse? I think that's the question we have to ask, and then that's the most important thing. Kim Jong-un was assassinated or died of illness. I think we could think of all kinds of different reasons. And if there is no control, then including a military, what's the cause for fight or combat? So there are all kinds of the different the factors we need to think about. So whether would become a guerrilla war, there is no certainty. I think we really think about the smooth transition or the very chaotic transition. Right after the war in Japan, U.S. estimate was that I think that Japan would fight until the end, and there will be a battle on the mainland. However, it didn't happen, and war ended. In case of Iraq, Saddam Hussein fell, and then the internal conflict occurred. I think it all depends on culture and history of any given country. So those are elements that need to be considered. But I think we have to keep studying all kinds of possibilities. I'm from the Defense College, and then when I was freshman, Mr. Oriki was senior. If there is the 1 year difference, then you treat it like dirt. So that's for a freshman, senior was God. So in front of the senior, before I speak, I think I would be scolded later. So I always ask the senior to ask senior to speak first with lots of respect. And with regard to the North Korea, my view is very similar to Mr. Oriki. I think it really depends how it collapses. For example, if leader was assassinated, or it might collapse in a fairly calm way and then gradually get absorbed to South Korea. Since that would happen in Korean Peninsula, so the threat to us is if the internal conflict that took place, it's possible a lot of spies might come to Japan. And then if it was the moderate collapse, then once that North Korea is unified with South Korea, when the unification happened in Germany, the West Germany had lots of economic power, and then the technological power, and then East Germany within Eastern Bloc had lots of economic power. However, when they got unified, that caused economic depression.
So let's apply this to North Korea, meaning that we will have a massive refugee problem if North Korea would fall. And thinking about those refugees, they might make their way to China or Russia. They may take a ship to Japan. So we would need to be prepared to accept or handle those refugees. And of course, that the United States forces would take the initiative or spearhead some of the activities. and Japanese self-defense force would not going to be the major primary role, but we will have definitely a logistical support to the United States.
Back.
I'd like to ask a question in Japanese. So this is so unusual because I usually cannot ask a question in Japanese. I am from Ryukyu Shimpo. My name is Hato. Thank you for mentioning Okinawa, Dr. Green, and also thank you for the question regarding the defense of Okinawa.
はい、先ほど、
Earlier, Mr. Oriki and Mr. Iwasaki talked about moving a base or moving a military power sends a signal that the alliance is weakened. So when you talk about move or realignment, what kind of scale are you talking about? For example, Marines in Okinawa or one unit in Okinawa, or what kind of scope are you talking about? If you could clarify that, that would be great. And also defense of Okinawa. Historically speaking, prior to World War II, Imperial Japanese Army or the forces, there was a air facility was built, and currently the air facility is now used by the U.S. forces. So what kind of implications or what kind of impressions do you have about this transition in terms of history? So I'm speaking before Mr. Oriki. So I should now take the microphone before Mr. Oriki is thinking about this rotation here. Thank you for the questions. So currently, Futenma replacement is being discussed. I mentioned earlier about that moving a base, it should not be a light decision. I am not saying either or fully move or any type of scope, but what Japan is going through is part of a bigger scheme or bigger planning. For example, moving a unit, if it's done in an abrupt manner, I think that shows weakness. And of course, in order for us to move a unit from the United States side or from Japan side, there is going to be a long and careful consultation and planning. So that's what's needed for careful realignment. Regarding Okinawa, that's my second hometown, because I was staffed in Okinawa as my first posting, and I spent 6 years there. And so Okinawan people went through very hardship during World War II. So from my personal understanding, I think I have that understanding. So Mr. Ota left a message, and I think that really rings deeply among Okinawan people, meaning that Okinawans or overall Japan should not accept any foreign forces. I think there's a message there. And so I think that the defense of Okinawa is coming from that kind of historical context as well. Mr. Iwasaki, I agree with him. Dr. Green talked about a realignment of a U.S. unit. My comment was not specific to Okinawa or any other bases in Japan or the United States. Well, I just wanted to mention that in a generic term, and also about strategy. There are many defense strategies, or maybe we should have a bigger scheme to consider one specific strategy. Regarding a realignment of a unit from Okinawa, I think Mr. Iwasaki spoke it really well. for the defense of Okinawa, this is not only for the United States challenge, but for us, Japanese self-defense force. So let's say that in the 1970s, there was some kind of invasion or a threat to invasion because there was a vacuum between from the United States withdrawal and then also maybe a big movement from the Russian army. So I am just speaking as a hypothetical. Mr. Gregson talked about this, about Yonaguni and also Miyakojima. There are some movements and also some actions according to the plan are undergoing. And there's 500 kilometers between those islands, or maybe a bigger distance. We did not have a unit, a military unit there, so meaning that there's a military vacuum. So we wanted to plug that in militarily. So having that unit, that really translates to deterrence. So not only to protect one specific island, but overall, there should be a sort of like a zone defense type of Okinawa islands and also multiple islands defense by placing a unit.
So we're getting to the end of the seminar. I wanted to ask Admiral Blair in a few minutes we have to explain some of the thinking about the China question. We've spent a lot of time on the immediate military threats, appropriately, North Korea. And I think before we end, we should hear from one of the panelists. I'd like to ask Admiral Blair some crystallization of what the views were on the longer-term, bigger challenge we're dealing with.
Had you sat in on our discussions on China, I think you'd be a little bit surprised. We did not spend most of our time talking about moving carrier battle groups and putting Coast Guard units moving forward in the Senkakus in the South China Sea. We felt that the military posture of the alliance was sufficient to make aggression against islands in that part of the world pretty unattractive, pretty high risk. What we discussed more was the sort of long-term geo-economic competition that China has undertaken with the rest of the world, as shown in the very ambitious One Belt, One Road infrastructure building plan across Asia, and particularly in the ambitions to be dominant in the 10 most important areas of technology in the future, as laid out quite explicitly in the Chinese document Made in China 2025, which lays out the areas of artificial intelligence, high-speed computing, robotics, the 21st century dominant technologies, and China openly saying that it's going to use all of the considerable tools at its disposal to be dominant in those sectors by 2025. And as I say, I think you would be surprised that militarily trained people felt that that was the aspect of our competition with China that ought to get our greatest attention, that we could handle the military side of it, keep things quiet, make aggression unattractive, but that this big technological, economic, human capacity, innovative competition is what's really going to make a difference in Asia, and the United States and Japan and the Republic of Korea needed to get on with being out front on it.
So, Winston Churchill had this famous quip, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And he and Roosevelt and Truman were very wise and lucky to have General Eisenhower in command in Europe, because if you'd had a famous, gung-ho warfighter like Patton or Bernard Law Montgomery, our alliances wouldn't have functioned. We've been very fortunate in more recent history to have admirals and generals steering our military strategy who have a very similar way of thinking about alliances and coalition, and especially our closest and most important allies, Japan in particular. And we're all lucky today, and with the Military Statesmen Forum, to have the wisdom of the gentleman on the stage and our participants in the MSF who are in the audience. So let's conclude. I want to invite you to join us for a reception if you have time. It's raining, so you may want to. But let's conclude by thanking our participants for their wisdom and their service.